Hi, Misha here, and last time we looked at the Soviet years of Mir, and this is where we left her off at. As 1991 closed out and the days of the USSR came to an end, this is where Mir was at. We had the core module, we had Gavant 1 and Gavant 2, and we had Crystal. Overall mass was around 60 tons in orbit, and habitable, or at least pressurized, volume was just over 250 cubic meters. Although if you count a Soyuz and Progress docked, which they almost always were, well, always a Soyuz, almost always a Progress, that would bump up to nearly 269 cubic meters. The Soyuz added roughly 10, and Progress would do 7, 8, give or take its exact configuration. EO-10 launched in October of 91 and would return to Earth in 1992 to the new Russian Federation. By this point, over 50 cosmonauts had visited the station, including some in the Cosmos program from not just the Warsaw Pact nations, but even Japan, France, Germany, and others. There had been 10, almost going on 11 major long-duration EO-type missions and 10 shorter-duration EP-type missions. There had also been over 40 Progress supply craft. Originally, the Progress was the first version. The Progress M took over between 1989 and 1990. And one thing I didn't mention in the first video that M was able to do was it could dock, undock, and redock. That will actually become quite important for kind of just managing things. And while the station wasn't young anymore, it wasn't old either. But there would be issues not just relating to age, but also just support and supply. And things like the girder system. They started to build it in 91, but by early 92, it still wasn't complete. And originally they had 2 more modules planned, but by 1992, the whole program was now under the Roscosmos brand, company, firm, agency, and they decided, you know what, this is good enough. Here we are. And officially on paper, while it had been suspended, the Mir program was still ongoing, but this would not keep for long. Budget cuts, supply shortages, labor shortages, strikes, loss of connections to manufacturers of parts in a now independent Ukraine meant that it was officially canned in 1993, although the writing had been on the wall for nearly half a decade. So here we have Mir. And they've also decided they can't leave it alone. Yeah, it only had been empty for a few months in the early years, but since, 87, 88, it had been constantly crewed by a rotating series of cosmonauts. And it's thought that, with all the maintenance needed, the computer systems, maintaining the solar arrays, and with the loss of kind of global communications data system, if we leave it, it's going to go to sleep and never wake back up. So the decision was made very early on to not only keep sending supplies and supporting it, but to continue sending expeditions, both long-term and short-term. And very early, a new partner was officially brought into the game. The United States of America. This really began in 1992 under the first Bush administration, when it was announced that Russia and the USA would combine their efforts and collaborate in space. Now, This had a few purposes. The U.S. did not want Russian technology to fall into the wrong hands. Plus, there were just advantages to having a partner in space. On the other hand, even though the U.S. quote-unquote won the Cold War, it would be suffering some budget cuts of its own. For example, Space Station Freedom would eventually get canned or morph. Keep in mind, though, Russia had Mir 2, which is actually much further along thanks to the DOS 8 module. And they had some very interesting plans for Mir 2. Tell you what. Back to the very beginning in 1976. This is when DOS 7 and DOS 8 were authorized. And originally, DOS 8 was meant to be a backup in case something happened to DOS 7 as the core. And this would evolve into Mir. And DOS 8 would be finished, at least the basic assembly, in 85. And they would kind of populate the inside through 86. But after the successful launch of 7, they have this module and don't really know what to do with it. And this is when the Mir 2 kind of comes together as an idea by 88. And over time, they just get more and more ambitious. This was originally, Mir 1 to be built with the 37K module, about a 7-ton. And then it went to the 77K type, which was a 20-ton module. Screw that, Mir 2 is supposed to have up to 90-ton modules. And they would have 4, maybe even 6 of them. It was also to have a truss system, solar arrays, and radiators, and be a big sprawling complex in space. Several hundred tons. It just kind of escalated until already in 89 they decided they went too far and they started to scale it back. And the original idea was for the first Mir station to last roughly 10 years, and then to kind of phase it out for Mir 2. But the program would get scaled back to what was known as kind of Mir 1.5, and that idea was to launch DOS 8 into orbit and have it actually connect with the Mir station, work together, and then eventually, a couple of years later, deorbit DOS 7 and have have DOS 8 take over as the Mir station core, kind of a handoff in space, and continue to ship other modules up. Well, the ending of the shuttle program in Russia kind of put pay to that. They didn't really have the ability to lift and work in space as they'd hoped. So by 91, 92, the idea of Mir 2 returns. And by that I mean launch DOS 8 into orbit by itself and construct a station around it. And now they're kind of returning to the idea of the 37K module like Avant 1. Add 3 or 4 here or there. And that was the plan that Russia would inherit from the Soviet Union, and it would actually go forward in 1992. In fact, in the summer of 1993, Energia would actually brief the USA, NASA, the powers that be, on their Mir 2 station plans. At the same time, the U.S. was still kind of floating the idea of freedom. Japan wanted to do a laboratory in orbit. The European Space Agency wanted to do something. Yeah, so they're all kind of wanting to do things in space, but money's tight. Now we've crossed from the Bush administration to the Clinton, but nevertheless, in September of 93, it was announced officially that there would be the Mir Shuttle or Shuttle Mir Program. And then a couple of months later, by the end of the year, it all kind of came together. And this would ultimately be the seed of the International Space Station we have today. But the International Space Station was considered Phase 2. Phase 1 would be a series of combined missions, which would ultimately lead to a half dozen dockings with the American Space Shuttle. But they would work up to that in 1994. In February of that year, the first cosmonaut would ride on an American Space Shuttle. And then a year later, there would be the Near Mir mission, where Shuttle Discovery would get very close, but not actually dock, but, kind of practice near rendezvous. Russian cosmonauts would take photos, kind of seeing what's going on. And then in March of 1995, the first American astronaut would ride on a Soyuz rocket to Mir as part of a new long-term expedition. So you have this exchange of crews, and they're working up to shuttle docking. And at this point, it's decided we can and will actually finish Mir, because it looks a little weird this way with two vertical modules and nothing on the longitudinal ports there. It works. But this would be true joint Roscosmos and NASA partnerships and money. If anything, Russia brought the expertise in working in orbit, and America brought money and a shuttle. That shuttle is very important. So, 1995 was a big year for Mir. Year for Mir. That was the year this began to look like this. Well, almost. There would be a little carryover into the 1996. Because really the only work that had been done since the fall of the USSR was they did actually complete the thruster package on the back of Covant 1 here. And that gave them kind of a more fuel-efficient way to manage control. Kind of completing what they'd already started. That's mostly just because they had this stuff ready to go and it was relatively small to launch. They did also do a test flight with a Soyuz, working with the docking apparatus on Kristall. But that was kind of just a proof of concept. In 1993, during the midst of talks with the West, there would be a special test project. Well, Buran was canceled, therefore its docking module on Kristall was really never used. And this module actually was an updated version of what was used on Soyuz Apollo back in 1975. So there's a certain common root with Western tech. So what Russia did, they fitted a Soyuz craft with the Apis 89 docking system on its habitat module, and it successfully docked with Kristall on the bottom, just to really prove that it worked on orbit and all that. That was in preparation for the next phases, and it wouldn't be long before Mir would see some rearrangement. Kristall would move a couple of times, although Covant.2 has always kind of stayed put. And Covant.1 is pretty much locked in place where it's at. Between June of 1995 and April of 1996, Mir would experience its next major expansion, with 2 major and 1 minor module being added, plus a little bit of new hardware. By this point, the Mir shuttle program is well underway. It agreed for a total of 11 flights. 9 of those would be dockings, and they agreed to 7 long expedition stays of a U.S. astronaut on board, plus, of course, the one Russian cosmonaut on a shuttle and other things. And there would be over a dozen other nations involved, either submitting their own cosmonauts, or experiments, hardware. Russia was very happy to rent out space on Mir, especially if you had good credit. And that actually gets us to our two major models, Spectre and Peroda, both of which date back to the 1980s and were more or less, at least externally, complete, but Russia never had the money to launch them. And interestingly, they were both meant for observation, but of two different natures. Peroda was always meant to be a low Earth orbit observation of the planet with various sensors and radar systems, but Spectre was originally meant to be part of Russia's response to Reagan's Star Wars plan of a militarized module with the ability to not only have a missile defense system on board and test things like that, but even maybe to launch their own ordnance, rockets, missiles, what have you. But this never really got much of anywhere aside from just building the modules. Spectre was a 77 KSO, and Peroda was a 77 KSI type module. And they were both a little bit bigger and heavier than would come before. And with NASA's funding, well, basically they would be renting space on board, especially with Spectre. It would not only have American and European experiments, it would actually be the living quarters for the visiting Russian astronaut. And it served one other very important purpose for Mir. Spectre would finally launch in May of 1995 and dock at the 1st of June. It went relatively smooth, although technically there were 2 attempts. And it would actually replace Crystal. Crystal would move from the bottom port to actually the forward-facing port. And Spectre would take its place, countering Pt.2. And you notice that it has 4 solar arrays. The 2 up here were originally planned. The 2 down below were actually added on to the design. In fact, this whole kind of conical cupola was added on when this went from being a military style to a civilian science. And it replaced some of that. That also meant this was a little bit longer than previous modules. And it had a little bit, just a tiny bit more habitable pressurized space, about 62 cubic meters. With these additional solar arrays, this acted as the power plant for Mir. Because by the 90s, it needed it quite badly. The old arrays were wearing out, natural damage and wear and tear and what have you. So yeah, that would dock. And then its sister module, which was always meant to be more Earth science based, would join it not quite a year later in April of 96. Peroda would actually be the largest module outside of the core itself. And it was interesting, even though it was originally planned to have solar arrays, for various logistical reasons it didn't. So it was fitted with a battery array to get to orbit, but half of the array failed, which meant it had exactly 1 docking attempt, and if that failed, it was pretty much lost. Luckily, on April 26, it did make it on its first go, and would counterbalance Crystal, which would eventually go over here to the port side after being in the middle. So that would be the final arrangement. Well, almost, because this Crystal has one more element on the end that This one does not. Oh, and just in case I didn't say it, Proto actually had 66 cubic meters of pressurized volume, but no solar arrays. Also, they moved one of the arrays from Crystal, one of the retractable ones, over to the main core and attached it to Cavant to try to improve the power situation a little bit. But that would actually only last a brief time, because soon the shuttle comes a-calling. Back in video 1, I said it's actually very fortunate that the Easy model is 1/200 scale, and that's because it actually scales with the Hobby Master Space Shuttle. It's also 1/200 scale, and that means this Soyuz is within scale. Now this video is not going to be on the Space Shuttle specifically, but after the near Mir mission that Discovery performed in June of '95, Atlantis would be the first to dock with the station. And it would actually dock with the Crystal module using the port originally intended for the Baran, and it would be located at the front node port to make sure it was well clear of any obstacles like solar panels. I do wish the Easy models actually just had kind of a Lego style plug where you could plug anything into anywhere. They don't. Each plug is actually specific to the module or node you have, and some things like Cavant and the core are permanently just same piece of plastic. In fact, same goes for Crystal. That's why I had to get an X-Acto knife out. It would have been cool. That way I could kind of show you, because it looks really strange with it sticking out front. And that was not an easy task to reposition a module that had been in place for years in space. But they did it, and the shuttle docked there successfully. Stayed for about 5 days. Undocked in July of '95. And that would actually be the only time they would have to do that. Because in November, Atlantis would return, this time bearing a gift. And just in case anyone ever sees this, yes, I know the shuttle should have the bay doors open in orbit all the time. Yes, one other part of the Mir shuttle program was the agreement for RKK Energia in Russia to produce a docking module, an interface, a compartment known as the SO1, or the docking compartment. This would made up with the adapter. It's about 5 meters by 3 meters, gave around a dozen extra cubic meters of pressurized space, but its main deal was just to make docking with the shuttle much easier and safer. And so what Atlantis would do, they would fly up in its cargo bay. That was basically the deal. If Russia built it, U.S. helped pay for it, and the U.S. would fly it to space in the cargo bay of the shuttle. I believe this was mission STS-74 in November. And once in orbit, it would use the Canada arm to lift it out. Essentially, it would lift it out of its cargo bay and cradle, and not connect it to Mir, but actually to its own external airlock in the back of the shuttle bay. So it would dock the SO1 to itself, attached to its airlock, and then that would actually fly up to Mir and then dock with the port intended for the Baran, and then they're connected. And then when Atlantis would leave a few days later, the port would remain behind on the station here. Also on this mission in the cargo bay, they brought a new set of solar arrays for the Cavant 1 module in the back, again to try to help with the power generation issue. Keep in mind this is still technically a few months before Perota would join up, so it's still sticking out the front, Crystal is. But at this point, with Spectre, Crystal, and the docking module, we have a volume of around 326 cubic meters. And then once we add Peroda a few months later, that bumps all the way up to 392, not counting Soyuz in progress. So if you count those, we're over 400, give or take. There's a little bit of back and forth about pressure and habitable and, internal space management, but you get the idea. And by this point, Mir has kind of put on its maximum weight by 1996 at quite an impressive of well over 100 tons, actually approaching 140 with a Progress and a Soyuz docked, all the modules, the truss structure, all the good stuff, of course, equipment on board, and that would change up and down a little bit over time, but this would be its kind of final configuration. And 96 would be the peak. Finally, with Peroda, they had a docking that was pretty much textbook. And it's actually a good thing they had Spectre first, because they needed the power for Peroda, because it didn't have its own solar arrays, and it had a bunch of experiments on board. If you tried to do a lot at once, it would be a power hog. And as I mentioned, with Soyuz attached were 400 cubic meters of habitable space, or at least pressurized. Yeah, it's an impressive structure. And even if some of the modules are getting a little old, we have 2 shiny new modules, and science will be done. And that's what you see. Whereas things like Pt.2 were still just more of a, workaday thing. Spectre, Peroda were observation, earth sciences, astronomy. Crystal still had experiments like the greenhouse and, generation of materials. The front part of the core was the heart of it, command and control. And then the back part of the core was still where the 2 living booths were for the cosmonauts. Again, the Russians would stick the Americans in the Spectre module. Hey, they did pay for it. Well, technically rent. And then, of course, Pt.1 was kind of the service module part of the back. A lot of the kind of original science there had been taken out and moved to other places where they had more room. And originally, Mir only had a crew of 2. That would expand to 3. And that would still kind of be the maximum for long term, but there would be times that it would have a temporary crew as high as 6. And that's not even counting when the shuttle would, pay a visit, which it would do with pretty good regularity. With the final configuration here, Crystal is on the side, and the shuttle can safely dock and not worry about knocking into arrays, antenna, other spacecraft, what have you. And it would be really cool if I could dock them together for you, but since the shuttle's die-cast and this is plastic, that's not happening. But I can at least lay them out. Mir, shuttle, and Soyuz. Obviously, Soyuz is by far the smallest, with only about 10 cubic meters. The shuttle actually moves that up to around 65, even 70 with the external airlock. Impressive enough. I mean, more than one single module on Mir, except for the core. But, Mir is the largest structure in space, heaviest, especially when it's docked with the shuttle and they kind of form one unit. Keep in mind, a lot of the shuttle's length and whatnot is devoted to its cargo bay, because that was its big deal. I mean, it could lift over 24 tons to low Earth orbit, although that would be very low. But still, that was kind of its most impressive feature, the Canadarm2, and ability to carry up to 10 people in an emergency, although 6 or 8 was typically the maximum. I think we sometimes forget just how impressive it really was, because Russia as impressive as Mir was still using 1960s technology in Soyuz, even with the TM models. It's just an incremental update. And even Mir itself, while it was an impressive engineering feat, a lot of the technology on board was not exactly cutting edge. Even Spectre and Perota were actually initially built in the 80s. And the core module really can trace its roots back to the 70s. But that's kind of where Russia's good, is just, solid, and also just on-orbit repairs. They were very, very good. American astronauts can do a lot with duct tape, but cosmonauts can do a lot with a hammer. So, there's that. Yeah, 96 was the peak of Mir. Yeah, some of the hardware is aging. Yeah, there were small little bumps in the road here and there, but thanks to partnering with the shuttle program, it had a new lease on life and funding, and Atlantis would be its primary visitor. It's already docked twice in 1995. It would dock 5 more times in 1996 and 1997. So of the 9 missions in the Phase 1 program, it would fly 7 of them. The other 2 dockings would actually come in 1998, first by Endeavour, and then June of that year, Discovery. When Discovery would undock, that would actually end the shuttle Mir program. And when it would land in July of 1998, it would officially end Phase 1 of the cooperation between Russia, the USA, Roscosmos, and NASA, not to mention Japan and Europe and some others. But frankly, it was impressive that it even happened. Because while 96 was a good year for Mir, 97 was the opposite of good. So much so that it was seriously considered canceling the shuttle Mir program prematurely, and with very good reason, because there's a couple of things you don't want to ever happen in space, and a couple of things that never actually ever happened in space and were just theoretically horrific. Well, guess what? They happened to Mir. I can think of 4 things that are just terrifying to contemplate in space. And they would all be happening to Mir in 1997. Now, I don't want to give the impression that it had had a completely easy life over a decade. No. There had been near misses, tiny collisions here and there. Power had shut off, solar arrays damaged, broken equipment. But all in all, to this point, nothing had happened that made it look like it could be done for. It was all stuff that the highly trained and highly resourceful cosmonauts could handle. Keep in mind, for a significant part of the orbit, they were not in direct communication with the ground. Yeah. And in 1997, there are still Americans visiting. There's always one on board between 95 and 98. So they get to see a lot of this firsthand. And the year started off eventfully. On February 23, 1997, someone said, "Do you smell something?" Quickly followed by one of the words you don't want to hear in space: fire. Yeah, there was a fire in Gavant 1. Luckily, they knew what to do. They had working fire extinguishers, and they had ventilators, breath masks, and oxygen supply, which is good because they actually exhausted the tanks and then had to switch over to just, filtering masks. Because think about it, you can't open a window in space. Well, you can, but that's going to lead to bigger problems. And you can't just go outside the house if it's on fire. So imagine being in a house that you cannot get out of. Now, of course, they had a contingency to use Soyuz as a lifeboat, and luckily the fire was on the other end, and luckily Progress docked to Cavant-1, not Soyuz. But either way, yeah, that wasn't good, and it did lead to damage. And they would do a valiant job of cleaning things up, but there would be burnt equipment, scorch marks, and the like, because, how much can you really do in space? One downside to the way the Soviets kind of did their space habitats is a lot of the equipment was installed at ground level and was literally too large to fit through the hatches. So even if something burned out in space, there's no real way to get rid of it or replace it. Thankfully, redundancy was on their side, and yeah, I wouldn't say a near miss. There was definitely a hit, and definitely showed the station's age, and power is still an issue. Even when Perota's not always sucking down what it can, it's just aging, and the computers are crashing and failing. A lot of stuff ends up being manual. Plus, Russia doesn't have all the services they once did. Like, for example, components of the automated docking system that Progress relied on were actually made by a Ukrainian company. So there were attempts throughout the year to work out something else, even if it's just going to manual docking, just in case. And that would, of course, lead to the big disaster in June. On the 24th of that month, it was decided, hey, let's undock our Progress M and practice manual docking. Let's not, but they did. And that led to the Bay accident a day later. Through understandable but still human error, the Progress craft came in way too fast to successfully dock at the back of Cavant-1. Missed it, thankfully, but then slammed into Spectre, one of the two nice new shiny modules, and also where an American astronaut was sleeping. Okay, he wasn't sleeping at the time, but still, it was his living quarters. So that sucks. Now, the Russians did what they could, and it was honestly thanks to quick action that the station wasn't lost and they didn't have to abandon it. Very quickly, they realized, first we heard the word collision and felt the thump, actually a couple of thumps, because it hit a couple of times. It really damaged one of the solar arrays. They didn't know how bad it was, so the collision's not good. That's when they had the American get in the lifeboat, just in case. The Russians, it's their station, their house, go to investigate, and then you hear something you really don't want to hear in space, and something that had actually never technically happened. There was a hull breach. They were losing atmosphere quite quickly. But through very quick actions, they seal the hatch and limit the depressurization to just Spectre down there. Kind of sucks for the American since all of his stuff was there, but he's alive. I guess he can borrow a toothbrush from one of the cosmonauts. And they start investigating already by the next day, and they will have several intravehicular spacewalks in August and September, and even after that, trying to figure out something to do. And they tried to find the leak, where the hull was cracked and ruptured, but they never, ever did. They knew there was a rupture, but they never could plug it. So it remained depressurized. Problem. Spectre was effectively the power plant of Mir. It had the newest solar arrays and the best ones. Without it, the station's not even having a brownout. It's just damn near blackout. And that's not even running the experiments in the other modules. Something has to be done about that. And not only do Americans know what's going on, they've got personnel there. That's why it was seriously considered ending the shuttle Mir program prematurely in the middle of 1997. But the Russians seem to be handling it. The astronauts on board Mir wanted to go forward. It is an international agreement, and it's felt like, Shuttle Mir is more than halfway over. Just a few missions left. Let's just soldier on. So eventually, they do. Kind of keeping to the schedule. And what they end up doing about Spectre, they design a special hatch with holes in it to run the power cables through, and they remotely connect to and remotely control the solar arrays in Spectre. Now, one of them is pretty major damaged, and this isn't as efficient, so they never get back full power generation, but they get 2/3 to 3/4 back, so not bad. I mean, it's better than absolutely nothing, that's for sure. I guess, though, the American's going to have to bunk with someone else. Wonder if one of them gave up their little phone booth for him. Or you can go live in the Progress craft next to all the trash. Because, yeah, they definitely use these as trash cans. Because not only can you not open a window to get smoke out in space, you can't exactly toss your trash out either. And now with 3 to 6 folks living on board and an aging station at that, there's not insignificant trash going on. But there's also still science going on. But there's still one more thing you really don't want to happen in space. An alien invasion. This was a known issue since the early days of Mir, but by the mid-90s, it's really becoming a thing. Mutated fungus, mold, and the like. There's even a species of mold on Mir that can live in a frickin' vacuum. There's lots of species, like 80 different ones. And it's just growing. Again, you can't take the station out of orbit for a good deep cleaning. They're pretty much using hand vacs and wet wipes, and, water has condensed in different areas and gotten behind panels, and unplanned visitors have come up from Earth on various cargo modules, and yeah, there's globs of mold and mildew and funk, and there's really no way to get rid of it. You can kind of control it, but come on, if it can live in a vacuum, Clorox isn't going to do a whole lot. So they just managed it. Also, keep in mind, this is recycled. They are going through the same filters and systems that have been working for over a decade. I believe it when astronauts said there was a unique smell going on. Can't open a window to get rid of the smell either. It's starting to really smell like a good old-fashioned locker room with a less than perfectly attentive janitor. That's not to say, again, the cosmonauts and astronauts are slobs. They do the best they can, but they've got a pretty full work schedule going on. They don't have a maintenance guy that just does that. Even then, I don't think he would have won against the mold, because I'm not sure it was terrestrial. I think we're going to look back in history and realize our first contact with alien life was actually the mold that was found on Mir. What do you think? Finally, there's just junk. Trash, old broken hardware, old left behind experiments, probably some old personal memorabilia from all the crews. By the time the last shuttle left in June of 98, we're on EO 25, plus there's been many more short duration missions, plus visitors from the shuttle. It's just getting cluttered. And it was never exactly the most ergonomic, comfy place. Have you ever been in a Soviet-era apartment block? I have. I've lived in one. Yeah, this was like that, only even more industrial. Look up pictures. They did their best, don't get me wrong, to make it homely, but it was kind of like living in a space submarine. And they'd actually quit using the shower a long time ago because it was more trouble than it was worth, so they're kind of back to using the sink and wet wipes to keep clean. Luckily, your body doesn't get as sweaty and grimy and dirty in space as it would on Earth. But of course, floating crap around, sometimes quite literally, is definitely an issue. They did their best to use the Progress as trash cans, but only so much you can do. But by 1998, Mir is at the end of its life. I mean, again, It was originally meant to be a 3-year mission, then a 5-year because someone watched too much Star Trek in Russia, and then it was extended out to a 10-year mission. It began in early 86, so by 98 it's already 2 years over its planned mission, and that original mission did not exactly factor in the fall of communism in the USSR and a couple of years of pretty severe neglect and shoestring budgeting. But they do soldier on. There would be more visitors, more expeditions after Shuttle Mir had concluded. Although, even from Russia, they're starting to wind down. EO-26 would begin in August of 1998 and run through early 1999. There would be experiments conducted, and they would be taken over in February of 99 by EO-27. I believe it was Soyuz TM-29's mission, which is a 3-person crew temporarily. We have a Frenchman from Europe. We actually have a Slovakian coming up. So we still have international visitors. We still have science going on. It still has outposts in space. And at this time, the only space station we have, shuttle's kind of off doing its thing. But this mission in 99, one of their goals was to basically mothball the station. And they would do just that. They would start to prep the station to go into hibernation. No one really knows if it can be restored or not, what's going on, but enough's enough. And they would eventually undock in August of 1999. And for the first time in over a decade, there's not a relief crew. There's not another mission, short or long, to take over. For the first time, Mir is all alone. It had not been left alone since the early days, 86, 87. But it's an impressive run. Of its time in orbit, it was occupied for a great majority of it, over a decade in total. Honestly, that's more you can say for America's Skylab. The Americans sent 3 missions to Skylab spanning 73 to the beginning of 74, and while there were plans to do more, it never happened. That's why Skylab burned up in orbit in 1979, littering Australia. At least the Russians got their worth out of Mir. I'll give them that. They even got America to pay for about half of it. So it's dormant. And that could have been the end, and almost was. However, there was one more mission. A little bit unplanned, but there was EO-28. Yeah, we get to the Mir Corporation, Mir Inc. Basically, the private idea to lease, rent, or sell this to private business interests. It's even often been reported Hollywood is a on-orbit film station or whatever, just privately owned and operated laboratory. Yeah. So, on April 4, 2000, the next, last, and final expedition would take off and dock. And they were charged with a few experiments, but they were basically charged with trying to reactivate it after being dormant for about half a year. And just kind of show to the folks on the ground, hey, this is still worth something. You can come up here and do whatever you want. I don't know, animal training. And they would stay for just over 2 months, so in terms of Mir, not the longest expedition by a long shot. I mean, after all, in 94, 95, the world record for time and space was set on board the station. And while the mission was nominally a success, it had a crew of 2. It didn't attract investors, buyers, what have you. So when they left on June 16, 2000, this really was the last time humans would metaphorically set foot on Mir. Or as I like to think of it, eventually the mold and mildew, the fungus, was victorious. But there is one way to surefire clean a place out from stuff like that. Burn it with fire. And that's exactly what would happen. And there would still be a couple more visitors to the station. They would just happen to be robots. The end of 2000 would see a few different Progress supply craft dock. In fact, there would be one come in not long before the end in 2001. And you might wonder why, since there's no crew on board. Well, first it was to kind of top off fuel and do that. It was also to give burns. The Progress could use its engines to direct Mir to deorbit in a controlled manner, and more or less at a date and time of their choosing. And while most of it would definitely burn up in orbit, well, you don't crash over 100 tons into the atmosphere and not have some residuals. Yeah, that's kind of what happened to Skylab in 79. No one got hurt, but no one wants that accident to have crap falling from space. So Progress would be sent up a couple of times to kind of prepare Mir for the end, also to win the war against the fungus. And final preparations we made in March of 2001. And then early on the 23rd, it would begin its descent, starting to drag against the upper atmosphere. And it wouldn't be long before it starts to heat up. Keep in mind, there are no heat shields or anything. And just like dozens upon dozens of Progress craft before it, it would start to glow and break up. Because keep in mind, it's not so much as you fall out of orbit, as to be in orbit, you have to have really, really good velocity. You're going really fast. Well, when you deorbit, you're shedding all that speed, and that's where all the friction against the atmosphere comes from, and this is definitely not aerodynamic. And that morning, Mir would be no more after 15 years in space. Some company really should do like a phases of Mir model where you can start from the basic core and kind of snap together modules and build it up. That would be really neat. I think so anyway. But here we go. Mir hosted over 100 astronauts, cosmonauts, visitors, not counting the mold. These would be from over a dozen nations. It had dozens of crewed flights and even more uncrewed. Thousands of experiments were conducted, not to mention observations, and not just of the Earth, but also of the galaxy and the universe. It fostered cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, and really the world, and really just proved that a modular space station could and should be done. Like I said, it was in space from the core onwards for over 15 years, and it was habited for about 10 years of that whole time. Even more if you think about it. And they definitely used it and wore it out. Took care of it as best they could, but yeah, it wasn't shiny new when they were done with it. While the U.S. went with the shuttle, but no stations, Russia would go the opposite route. But again, since 1971 and the first Salud, they really would focus on space stations. They had actually more than anyone else. Not that there's a huge category. And I think it's really neat. I just enjoy space flight, space history. I didn't go through a lot of names or even exact dates in this video, firstly because I'm just doing this off the top of my head, and second, you can Wikipedia those if you want. They're all out there. I just do it to have fun. Like I said, had a Revel 144, and then 2 of the 1-200 Easies, and then the Hobby Master shuttle. Hobby Master actually makes all the shuttles. And this one's actually in die cast, which is pretty neat. And it's mostly metal. Even the tail, even the doors, as you could hold. They even have kind of a spring action. Pretty cool. I would like to see them do a 1/144 scale of this. A 172 would be awesome, but probably a little big. An impressive machine in its own right. And I really wish there were more models of Soyuz available. I just have a handful. And none of them are die-cast, and none of them are particularly, dynamic. It'd be really neat to have one that you can separate the modules. Because there are 3. The Habitat module up here, the reentry kind of crew module, and then the service module. And then, of course, the solar panels, which would retract. Maybe one day. Anyway, as I said, Shuttle Mir would end in 1998 and was successful. It was also considered Phase 1. Going all the way back to 1993, a total of 3 phases were planned out. And they would actually all be completed because literally as Phase 1 ended, that same very year, Phase 2 would be well underway. And it would both be and not be Space Station Freedom, Mir 2, because of course next time we get to talk about the ISS. And it just builds upon what was learned with Mir and to some extent Skylab. And of course today we also have China doing a station. Interesting times. But that's for next time. Appreciate you tuning in, and hope you're interested in this stuff too. I always have been. It's not a new interest of mine. I think it was probably my first interest as a living being on this planet. Literally at the age of 3 or 4, I liked the whole space thing. And I was always more into the technical aspects and whatnot than more of the fantastical. Then again, that was kind of the height of the whole Reagan Star Wars thing. And also the George Lucas Star Wars thing. Just kind of had Star Wars in general. With that, this is Misha. And I'll catch you, hopefully soon, next time when we talk about the International Space Station.